The freight runner came in on autopilot, which was the only way anything came to Veth's cradle anymore. I heard it before I saw it, that familiar low groan of attitude thrusters correcting against the moon's drift, and I set down my calibration kit and climbed the access ladder out of sub-level 3, because the runner wasn't due for another 11 days, and I had nothing else to do but investigate anomalies. That was the job, 11 years of the job. The vault designation was Colonial Compact Emergency Preservation Unit 7, registered to the Veth Settlement Authority, which had ceased operations 4 years prior. The authority had left me a note, actual paper, which I'd kept, that said, "Facility to remain on standby. Report any systems variance. A supply ship would be coming." The last supply ship had come 3 years ago. I'd been reporting systems variance to a dead address ever since, because the registration was still current, and the registration being current meant the facility existed, and the facility existing meant I existed, and so I kept reporting. The freight runner docked at berth 2. Its manifest filed automatically to my terminal. 1 crate, designated inert chemical supply, coolant compound, consignee listed as Unit 7. I hadn't ordered coolant compound. Unit 7's coolant lines were sealed and dead. I stood in the docking bay and looked at the crate for a long time before I opened it. Inside was a coolant drum. Standard Class C transit canister. Rated for 14 days sealed. Emergency air supply built into the lining. The kind rated for 14 days because the engineers who designed it knew you might need to keep something alive. I unsealed it. She was curled in the bottom like she'd decided to sleep there and had made the best of it. Pale gray skin, silver hair, matted and damp from the canister humidity. Ears that came to soft points. Eyes that opened when the seal broke and found my face and held it without blinking. Amber. The color of old resin. The color of a thing that had been waiting a long time. Around her right wrist, wrapped twice and knotted, a strip of heat tape. Scratched into it in deep, careful lines, scratched by someone who had pressed hard because they only had one chance, was a string of coordinates. A Sorath resettlement depot, 3 sectors out. I stood in my docking bay with 11 years of silence behind me and a small gray child at my feet, and I thought, someone put her here on purpose, sealed her in coolant-grade air and labeled her inert, and sent her to the one registered facility in this sector, because a registered facility has to file a biological discovery report, and a filed report means a welfare hold, and a welfare hold means the clock starts running in her favor. Whoever sealed her in that canister had known exactly what they were doing. I lifted her out. She weighed almost nothing. She smelled like recycled air and something dry and faintly mineral, the way places smell when there hasn't been enough water for a while. I carried her to the medical bay, which still had power because I kept everything on minimum draw, and I sat her on the cot and got her water, and she drank it like she'd been rationing herself to sips. My first act was not to comfort her. My first act was to go to the terminal and file a biological welfare discovery under Colonial Compact Code, subsection 14, paragraph 3, time-stamped, logged, transmitted to the compact relay, and to the Sorath Resettlement Coordination Office at the coordinates on her wrist. I filed it in the first 40 minutes, before I'd done anything else, because subsection 14 only protects you if you file before the transit claim arrives. I'd read the code. I'd had 11 years to read things. The transit claim arrived on day 3. A Veth Syndicate docking skiff. 2 men and a woman, the woman carrying a Class 4 transit recovery order on behalf of the Syndicate's Biological Cargo Reclamation Division. Clean paperwork. Legal paperwork. The kind of paperwork that should have terrified me. I met them at the airlock in my maintenance coveralls, and I did not open the door. "You have a biological asset logged to this facility under a colonial welfare hold," the woman said. Her voice was the voice of someone who'd done this before and found it boring. "The asset was consigned to a syndicate transit manifest before your hold was filed. Prior claim supersedes." "Prior claim," I said, "does not supersede a Class A biological quarantine protocol invoked under the Compact's Emergency Preservation Unit Charter. Unit 7 is a designated Class A containment facility. Any living biological entity brought into contact with Class A environmental systems must undergo a minimum 14-day bioclearance cycle before transfer can be authorized. That's Article 9 of the EPU Charter. The Charter predates your transit manifest by 42 years. She looked at me for a moment. You're invoking EPU quarantine on a child. I'm invoking the protocol this facility was built to operate. I don't write the charter. I maintain the facility. The facility requires 14 days. I looked at the three of them through the airlock glass. Your claim is valid. Come back in 14 days, and we'll discuss transfer. They didn't go far. The skiff sat in low orbit. I went back to the medical bay. She was sitting on the cot with her knees pulled up, watching the doorway. When I came in, she tracked me with those amber eyes, and I realized she'd been listening to all of it. She was young, but she wasn't simple. She understood more than I'd given her credit for, and I adjusted for that. I brought her food from the emergency ration stores, grain concentrate and reconstituted protein, which was all I had, and which she ate without complaint, in a way that told me she'd eaten worse. I found a thermal liner in the emergency kit and folded it into a pillow. I showed her the head, the water reclamation tap, the emergency comm panel. I showed her where the lock was on the interior door. She touched the heat tape on her wrist, looked at me. Sorath Resettlement Depot, I said, pointing at the strip. 3 sectors out. I sent them a message. They're coming. She looked at the strip for a long time. Then she nodded, once, careful and slow, like someone who had been disappointed before and was managing expectations. I understood that. We spent 11 days in something that was not quite company and not quite silence. She followed me on my rounds, the calibration checks, the pressure readings, the coolant line inspections that were completely unnecessary because the coolant lines had been dead for 4 years and weren't going to change. She watched me run the checks with a focused, unsentimental attention that reminded me of something I couldn't place. And then one morning I realized she was learning the facility. She was memorizing it the same way she'd memorized the address on her wrist, in case she needed it, in case something else went wrong. I didn't tell her she wouldn't need it. On day 11, she found the paper note from the Veth Settlement Authority in my work locker. I'd left the locker open while I was pulling a calibration kit, and she held it carefully with both hands and looked at it for a long time. She couldn't read it. She handed it back to me and pointed at it with a question in her face. "A note," I said, "from the people who own this place. They said a supply ship was coming." She looked around the empty bay, at the dead coolant lines, at the maintenance log on the terminal, 11 years deep with no replies. She looked back at me. "I know," I said. "I stayed anyway." She seemed to think about that. Then she climbed back up on the cot and pulled the thermal liner around her and went to sleep. The Sorath coordinator arrived on day 13, a woman named Orphan Verath, who had gotten my transmission and come immediately and who wept briefly in the docking bay before she composed herself and went into the medical bay and knelt on the floor and spoke to the child in a language I didn't know. Whatever she said took a long time, and I stayed in the corridor. When they came out, the child was holding the coordinator's hand. She stopped in front of me, reached up and pressed the heat tape strip. She'd taken it off her wrist, into my palm. The coordinates were worn down to shadows from a week of her touching them. I put it in my chest pocket. I filed the transfer paperwork. I filed the notice to the syndicate skiff. I filed the welfare hold closure report to the dead compact relay address, because the registration was still current, and that meant the facility existed, and I had a responsibility to keep the record complete. I filed everything, in order, the way I always had. Orphan Verath shook my hand and said something about what I'd done, and I didn't know what to say to that, so I said the facility was still operational, if she ever needed it. She smiled. It was a careful smile, the kind people aim at old men who haven't talked to anyone in a long time. I watched the coordinator's ship break atmosphere. Then I went back down to sub-level 3 and ran the calibration checks. On day 17, my heart stopped. The last entry in the maintenance log reads 0611, all systems nominal, pressure stable, registration current, no anomalies to report. Which was true. Everything was exactly as I'd kept it.